forthcoming in 2018, which examines the difficult histories of the digital humanities in relation to race, sexuality, gender, disability, and fascism. She is also co-editing A Cultural History of Race in the Renaissance and the Early Medieval and the Early Modern Age with Kimberly Coles with Bloomsbury. And finally, she is also editing a special issue of Medieval Feminist Forum, a journal of gender and sexuality, on medieval trans feminisms, also forthcoming in 2018. She is the medieval editor for the Orlando Project 2.0 and can be followed on @DorothyK98. She was named by Diverse Issues in Higher Ed 2015 Emerging Scholar Under 40 program. And she will be teaching a class with Angel Nieves of Yale University in 2018 on race, social justice, DH methods and applications at the University of Victoria. So as you can see, she's quite busy, and we are excited to welcome her here today to speak on some of those issues.
So thank you all for inviting me, and particularly for Catherine for thinking about me. So this is something that I've been working on and off for a little bit, so I'm excited to actually deliver it here. It's basically embodying the database, race, gender, social justice, and the history of the digital humanities. Tell me if the tech people can hear me and the microphone. Are we good? Okay. All right, so, and we get to see lots of Prezi slides. In Tara McPherson's groundbreaking 2012 article, Why Are the Digital Humanities So White? Or Thinking of the Histories of Race and Computation, she explains, quote, the difficulties we encounter in knitting together our discussions of race or other modes of difference with our technological production within the digital humanities or in our studies of code are actually an effect of the very designs of our technological systems, designs that emerge in post-World War II computational culture. These origins of the digital continue to haunt our scholarly engagements with computers, underwriting the ease with which we partition off considerations of race in our work in the digital humanities and digital media studies, unquote. She asked whether critics may, quote, argue that the very structure of digital computation develops at least in part to cordon off race and to contain it. Further, might we come to understand that our own critical methodologies are the heirs to this epistemological shift, unquote. She points to Omi and Wynand when she asks, how might we understand the infusion of racial organizing principles into the technological organization of knowledge after World War II? Her article then juxtaposes the development and structural frames of Unix in relationship to the goals of modularity as a way to decrease global complexity and cleanly separate one neighbor from another, with urban flight, spatial segregation, and also with the literary theoretical tradition of new criticism, which became central during the Cold War. As she explains from the work of Christopher Newfield and Gerald Graff, new criticism's relentless formalism, a logical corollary to depolitization that replaced agency with technique, the critical discussion aligns new criticism's frames with the frames of business management culture, modular systems, and also computational modular code. The decoupling of context and relationality from textual culture becomes a means to put distance from the bodies at the center of text, textuality, data, and databases. McPherson wrote and published the article in a world she described as post-racial. I think we have at this particular political, cultural, and critical moment debunked that myth of post-racial. Her call to extend critical methodologies for literacies in code, algorithms, interface, have now become daily journal articles in a late fascist surveillance culture that this week wants to continually erase all data from multiple agencies, acquire and use the DACA data to deport our students, and now allow our internet, Facebook, phone service providers to use and sell your data for profit, if not for psychological, political persuasion. We are bombarded every day in personal, local, national, and global ways with how very much digital data, tools, algorithms, and interfaces are not neutral. As we have watched in the last several years of elections, it has been palpably clear that our digital tools, our digital systems, our scholarship, our bodies are political. There is no hiding behind the sign of neutrality. My talk today takes McPherson's methodological call to arms for a practice that will value broader context, meaningful relation, and promiscuous border crossings. I will examine the database, data, and information textuality through the historical lens of a very long history of informational communication, also known usually as the history of the book. From the angles of surveillance studies, Sylvia Winters and Alexandra Wahilea's work on Black feminism and biopolitics, as well as a way to consider literary reader response and reception theory. This talk is both about the materiality of text, platform studies, media archaeology, as well as an examination in designing interactive media structures. I tell the promiscuous history of the database, one that is transhistorical, transatlantic, and transmedial. My main point is to ask and try to answer the question that McPherson centers in her article, quote, "So if we are always already complicit with the machine, what are we to do?" unquote. At various points during this talk, we will encounter what McPherson desired in a different vision of the digital humanities, quote, "hybrid practitioners, artist theorists, programming humanists, activist scholars, theoretical archivists, critical race coders," unquote. This talk also examines the visibility and legibility of bodies and the tactics used in both surveillance and sousveillance. As Simone Brown explains in her book Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, quote, "Steve Mann developed the term sousveillance as a way of naming an active inversion of the power relations that surveillance entails. Sousveillance for Mann is an act of observing and recording by an entity not in a position of power or authority over the subject of the valence," unquote. Thus, this talk sifts through and examines the texture of databases in telling the stories of the bodies visible and marking those bodies, and allowing those bodies to find ways to enact sousveillance. This is the unbound history of the database, an informational and textual form that has a temporal medieval beginning. As a technological informational structure, databases always have the pitfall of structuring racism, sexism, ableism, and other systems of oppression. Because a database organizes data and thus bodies, its mechanisms of organization, its various modes of interface are always in relation to the body sensory experiences. In addition, I speak today about the database as an eclectic mechanism of organizing communication because it is also the foundational narrative told about the digital humanities. However, what are other models of databases that glitch and rearrange our frames? My talk's itinerary begins in pre-colonial and pre-Columbian America, travels onto industrial 19th century France and England, before a transatlantic discussion between the US and Europe. Temporally, I begin in late medieval time, but in the Americas. So, an alternative history of the digital interactive database. The first informational interface in my promiscuous media history situates us in the medieval temporal spaces of the Americas. In this case, this temporal geographic location allows a traditional frame, the history of the book. In Matt Cohen and Jeffrey Glover's collection, Colonial Mediascapes, they explain in their introduction how they expand past the frames of European-centered book history in order to bring other communication forms into discussion. Their expansion moves away from linear models of progress development in discussions of the history of the book. Inspired by the push of the work of Elizabeth Boone and Walter Magnolla's edited volume, Writing Without Words, Cohen and Glover are especially cognizant of Boone and Magnolla's point that the history of writing is not an evolutionary process driving towards the alphabet, but rather a series of co-evolutionary processes in which different writing systems follow their own transformations. Thus, they argue that, quote, the medium shapes but does not determine meaning in communication, unquote. They move away from writing text book history as centered on narratives of Western European scholarship and towards media as a way to open up non-alphabetic driven forms of communication, including performance and other than textual communication and reconstruction of one prime example of American media that is a form of other than textual communication is the Andean quipu. In earlier accounts, as in Samuel Purchas's Pilgrims containing a history of the world and sea voyages and land travels by Englishmen and others, in his section entitled The Discourse of the Diversity of Letters, used by the diverse nations of the world, unquote, the South American quipu was imagined as a visual communication alphabet. As Purchas writes, quote, now superabounded, both in the subject and instrument, some writing with pencils, as the Japanese and chinois, others with pens, others with instruments of iron, as the Malabars of gems, brass, also other metals and table books, leaves, barks, wood, stone, air, sand, dust, metal, paper, cloth, parchment, and innumerable other materials in the form also and manner, with quipus in stone or threads, as in Peru, with pictures as in Mexico, and the Egyptian hieroglyphs, unquote. Instead, the Kipu is a tactile, haptic, native database system. I offer Kipu as an example in order to resist ideas of the database's evolutionary progress model. The Kipu is an alternative media history node that is part of a long history of informational communication. In addition, it demonstrates the different directions and capaciousness that databases and the bodies they organize can take. The Andean Kipu is an early informational communication database, food and agricultural inventories, the organization of villages and other population centers, calendars, genealogies, and thus various types of statistical counting. Reportedly from the testimonies of Spanish colonizers, Kipus also were used to record letters, histories, family information, narrative stories. It is an informational media database that has a history that began before 32, but takes its name, the Kipu, from the term for knot, from the administrative as a data system constructed of skins and knots. It is an interactive haptic mise-en système. Joanna Drucker, in her book Graphesis, Visual Forms of Knowledge Production, has discussed how digital media environments are a mise-en système. In an article in Feminist Debates in DH that's about to come out that I wrote, I have explained that this means that they need multimodal reading, creation, and interpretation, that an interactive mise-en système is, in Drucker's word, an environment of action. I have argued that though medieval book history invented the organizational frames of the mise-en-page, layout, marginalia, paratext, columns, table of contents, indexes, chapter headings, medieval manuscripts, can also be an interactive mise-en système. What we find here in the pre-Columbian and pre-colonial contact with the European Codex is an interactive digital interfacing with hands and fingers, mise-en système that is an informational ecosystem, always in flux, in which the main question posed is how to interface iteratively and at various moments. The Kipu is a digital, interactive, and haptic mise-en système informational database that requires dynamic, multimodal, embodied making and reading. But its very essence is an embodied and vibrant digital system. The Kipu is created by twisting, knotting, weaving various cotton and/or animal hair threads that has been seen by the leading scholar on Kipu as a version of binary code. As Gary Earth's system of communication based on units of information that takes the form of strings of signals, of signs or signals, each individual unit of which represents one or the other of a pair of alternative, usually opposite, identities or states, unquote. Last year, media reports about Sabine Hyland's current anthropology article have revealed that her analysis of later Kipu in the Andean village of San Juan de Colada from the 17th and 18th centuries may be evidence of a logosyllabic writing system that uses the different chords, using multiple forms of animal hair and 14 different colors that allow for 95 chord patterns to create combinations that represent syllables or words. Hyland's recent research also highlights the complexity of a native media item that has a long direct effect to its current use in Andean life. This then is a complex, iterative, ever-changing history of an indigenous American media database. Its media archaeology is based on the hardware hair, vicuna, alpaca, guanaco, llama, deer, and the rodent vizcacha, as well as cotton. One of the interesting questions that Urton and other Kipu scholars have discussed is who actually made the Kipu? Who made the hardware of this database device and who structures its coded software? This question has vexed scholars because there's no definitive account that explains exactly who made them in the early Spanish colonial documents of South America. However, Urton highlights an illuminating passage from the account of the 17th century Augustinian friar Antonio de la Plancha in his Crónica Moralizada del Orden de San Agustín en el Perú. Calancha describes the work of a Kipu Maya, a knot maker or record keeper reader, as follows, quote, the Kipu Maya continually studied the signs, ciphers, and relations, teaching them to those who would succeed them in office. And there were many of these secretaries, each of whom was assigned his particular class of material, having to suit or fit the story, tale, or song to the knots of which in his sense of sight memory, principal memoria local, unquote. The description indicates that the Kipu Maya's role was that of someone who could add, subtract, read, explain for this media database. Others created the physical components of the media database and also set the software encoding, the framework of knots and colors, etc. Irving explains that explicit discussion of who created the Kipu's components may have been so obvious that Spanish colonial documentary accounts do not see the need to discuss it. Andean culture had a high production and output of textiles. Women created the textiles. Women, as we see in this image from Philippe Guanam, who spun thread. The research, though Irving and other scholars wish there were more evidence or explicit evidence, indicates created the software, the code itself, to frame out the Kipu as media database, an interactive, multimodal database system constructed in binary code. We have a long, capacious history of such a database built, designed and produced by native Andean women as part of their deep textile weaving cultures. It's from Guaman Pomo de Ayala's El Primer Nueva Crónica that we also have an example of how a haptic, digital interactive database mise en système can be translated to the European Codex mise en page. El Primer Nueva Crónica's first written page discussed the past of men and women in Incan society has a mise en page layout that appears to be a form of intermediation. Laid out in descending triangle at the top, Pomo de Ayala appears to have added lines on the page as hanging down like cords on a kipu. Thus, the directionality of media history does not move linearly in a progress model of mise en page to eventually mise en système, but rather has multiple paths and loops. In addition, Rothbauer's article entitled Writing as Kipu argues that the book Instrucción del Inca Don Diego de Castro Titucusi Yupanqui al Licenciado Don Lope Garcia de Castro, a 1571 collaboration between Titucusi Yupanqui, the second to the last ruler of the Inca dynasty, and an Augustan monk and mestizo secretary, exposes how Titucusi saw European codex writing culture as a form of Kipu. Titucusi also framed the Augustinian monk and mestizo secretary as a Kipu Maya, who could take his communication and mold it to the appropriate material and genre forms of the Spanish documentary culture. These examples show that there have always been models of digital interactive and haptic media, especially beyond the Western European models, that have set up ideas of progress loops and Lovelace. The juxtaposition of text, textile, textuality has been an ongoing. It becomes a central metaphor in a very English romantic and very early Victorian literary and scientific history. In this temporal geographical instance, the history of databases returns to the texture of materiality and the metaphors of cloth and fabric in the form of the jacquard loom, the figure of Ada, Countess of Lovelace, and the theorization of computational database software. The narrative of digital databases picks up in the late 18th century with the silk weaving loom in the city of Lyon. As a recent critic of textile preservation explains, quote, the loom code for processing infinitely complex information, unquote. The innovation that occurred in the Lyonnais silk industry was Joseph Marie Jacquard's refinement and invention of a programmable loom in order to more quickly produce silk jacquard fabric. This was accomplished through the use of paper punch cards that would direct the loom to precisely weave the silk jacquard fabric and change the speed of production from 2 inches a day to 2 feet a day of material. This also put many bodies out of work who previously had hand-fed the loom patterns into the loom. The jacquard loom, invented and patented in 1801, revealed how the loom itself was the hardware of this computational system, and the punch cards were the software. And if you ever wondered where the term Luddite comes from, this is where it actually comes from. In England, Charles Babbage and Ada, Countess of Lovelace both were enamored with the jacquard loom, and particularly the role of these punch cards. So Augusta Ada Byron, 1815 to 1852, was the only legitimate child of the Romantic poet Lord Byron and Annabel Milbank. She knew her father for the first month of her life and never saw him again. Her mother raised and educated her from all accounts in a way to try to curb any poetic and excessively romantic tendencies. She was instructed in the logics of math and music. She and her mother circulated among the London salons of Charles Babbage, a well-known scientist and inventor, whose frequent guests included a varied intellectual circle, among them the female mathematician and scientist Mary Somerville. Somerville apparently became keen on mathematics through her reading of Victorian embroidery magazines that included complex mathematical puzzles for their readers. At one of Babbage's salon in June 1833, Ada Lovelace engine. This was an automatic calculating machine powered by steam that used punch cards. She and Babbage corresponded for numbers and scientific interests, and particularly his next iteration of a steam-powered engine, the analytical engine. This was never produced because of the lack of financial backing, but the ideas of the Museum of London used the design schematics of the analytical engine and assembled one in the 21st century. In 1843, Ada Lovelace published a translation into English from the French of the Italian engineer Luigi Minerva's explanation of Babbage's analytical engine. After this translation, Lovelace adds later that both explain the engine but also theorize this possibility. She writes, quote, "The difference engine can, in reality, as has been already partly explained, do nothing but add, and any other process, not excepting those of simple subtraction, multiplication, and division, can be performed by it only just to that extent in which it is possible by judicious mathematical arrangement and artifices to reduce them to a series of additions. The analytical engine, on the contrary, can either add, subtract, multiply, or divide with equal facility and perform each of these four operations in a direct manner without the aid of any of the other three. This one fact implies everything, and it is scarcely necessary to point out, for instance, that while the difference engine can merely tabulate and is incapable of developing, the analytical engine can either tabulate or develop," unquote. The specific difference between the possibilities of the two engines are then moved into the language of textual, textile, textured metaphor, when Lovelace explains, quote, "The distinct characteristic of the analytical engine, which has rendered it possible to endow mechanism with such extensive faculties as bid fair to make this engine the executive right hand of abstract algebra, is the introduction into it of the principle which Jeffrey devised for regulating, by means of punch cards, complicated patterns in the fabrication of brocaded stuffs. It is in this that the distinction between the two engines lies. Nothing of the sort exists in the different engine. We may say most aptly that the analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as the Jeffrey loom weaves flowers and leaves," unquote. Lovelace identifies the vision of a programmed computer close to 100 years before its operational existence. She expressed this technical vision through a poetic metaphor. In this way, her notes of a translator become the text where the arts collaborate with mathematical science. Her article becomes the ground in which the Western European frame of the digital database springs. Lovelace also wrote several command sequences for the analytical machine and used, played, and refined several structural tricks, the subroutine, the loop, and the jump, in completing these sequences. These terms and practices are standard in computational processing and particularly reference back to the importance of textiles and tactility in the history of computational databases. In particular, the idea of the loop becomes a way to create instructions that would allow an engine or a computer to go back and repeat a previous sequence. Lovelace thus invented the computational loop, as Howard Rheingold explains, quote, "the most fundamental procedure in every contemporary programming language," unquote. One of Lovelace's imagined future potentials for the analytic engine was that the engine could compose constantly. Wilcox at the Bodleian Library and a team of musicologists and computer scientists have experimented with the analytical engine and Lovelace's interest in programming music. They have run a series of humanities making experiments that have involved a variety of techniques, from a software simulator, a web app, and the use of a computer algebra system, to construction of Arduino microcontroller hardware agent-based simulation and scripted for modern professional audio tools. These experiments created an analytical engine soundscape through their computational fabrication. Steve Goodman's essay, The Ontology of Vibrational Force, in Sound Studies Reader, explains that sound comes to the rescue of thought rather than the inverse, forcing it to vibrate, loosening up its organized or petrified body. This is such an experiment that makes us sensorially reevaluate the texture of the created and technical beginnings of computational programming temporary bodies. But it is Edmund Chang's forthcoming essay, Why Are the Digital I feel most intricately with these elements of texture, text, textiles of early software computing. The essay is written in code, and it's an actual text game that at one point asked you whether you want to play as Alan Turing, Ada Lovelace, or Perna, a character from Techland's 2011 Dead Island game. If you choose Ada Lovelace, you play a text game set in the loom room, filled with various woven, textured, tapestry, tufted, and embroidered fabrics. And then you come up upon her image done in text code. In this way, Chang's textual textured essay game performs a loop. It returns to the Jacquard loom, and Charles loops back to the woven image of Jacquard that Babbage displayed as a curiosity for guests in his salon. The image of Joseph Marie Jacquard with his loom and the tools of his trade that on first glance appears to be an etching, but as Prince Albert correctly guessed, is actually a woven textile that took 24,000 punch cards to create. It loops to the mathematical puzzles available in Victorian women's embroidered magazines. It returns to the lace in Ada's own name. If Chang's option to play Ada allows us to loop back to the history of computer software and database programming and the metaphors of gender, textile, textuality, text, it is Chang's options to play Perna, the Black female character in the 2011 zombie game Dead Island that reminds us exactly how racist, gendered, and oppressive systems are built into the coded machine. The game company that created Dead Island accidentally sent a copy of the non-retail version to Steam. The computer game unlocked the game's coding to find out that Perna was assigned an unlockable skill that allowed her to, quote, deal extra damage against male victims, unquote. In the game, it's termed Gender Wars, but the code shows that it was named by the computer feminist whore Perna. If you wonder why digital intelligence models currently are racist and sexist, you can see this as an example of how digital computational design is an extension of the bodies that create it. This is the effect of having our digital humanities be so white and often so male. The creation of software to weave, loop, link, algebraic code, and the computational fabrication that can turn digital computer text and schematics into musical and visual art reveal the possibilities of the computational database. But always in these often awe-inspiring, breathtaking examples are the coded ghosts of these machines. As we follow the media object and texture of the punch card, we return to Tara McPherson's question, quote, so if we are always already complicit with the machine, what are we to do, unquote. So the story of the punch cards, and this is the bit where I say the content warning, I'll be talking about genocide. So digital humanities and data ethics. After the 2016 presidential election, an online petition and activist groups sprung up in the tech industry. Their website, Never Again, posted a pledge that began to gather signatures from tech workers in the US. Quote, we, the undersigned, are employees of tech organizations and companies based in the United States. We are engineers, designers, business executives, and others whose jobs include managing or processing data about people. We are choosing to stand in solidarity with Muslim Americans and immigrants and all people whose lives and livelihoods are threatened by the incoming administration's proposed data collection policies. We refuse to build a database of people based on their constitutionally protected religious beliefs. We refuse to facilitate mass deportation of people the government believes to be undesirable. We have educated ourselves on the history of threats like these and on the roles that technology and technologists played in carrying them out. We have seen how IBM collaborated to digitize and streamline the Holocaust, contributed to the deaths of 6 million Jews and millions of others. We recall the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. We recognize the mass deportation precipitated the very atrocity the word genocide was created to describe, the murder of 1.5 million Armenians in Turkey, knowledge that genocides are not merely a relic of the distant past, among others, to see ruin victims in our lifetimes. Today we stand together to say, not on our watch and never again. So this is before the recent use of that term for basically the Parkland students. This pledge makes clear a central and salient point in the field of digital humanities. Bodies are forms of data. Data is always embodied. What powered the Third Reich's ability to automate the Holocaust was IBM's Hollerith punch card machine platform. IBM's Hollerith punch card machine platform platform was a technology of what Simone Brown defined as racialized surveillance. Quote, when enactments of surveillance reify boundaries along racial lines, thereby reifying race, and where the outcome of this is often discriminatory and violent treatment, unquote. Webb actually was invented and then first used as a mass data processing platform to tabulate the 1890 US Census. Herman Hollerath's tabulating machine company would eventually become the International Business Machines Corporation, when Hollerath sold the company to Charles Flint in 1911, and Thomas J. Watson became the CEO. Thomas J. Watson is a figure that is intimately involved in both the Third Reich's automation of the Holocaust and the first purported digital humanities project. In numerous digital humanities collections, a handbook for the digital humanities, defining the digital humanities, debates in the digital humanities, the history of humanities computing has been described as one that dates back to the 1940s and the work of Father Roberto Bussa, an Italian Jesuit priest who launched the tool to perform text searches of St. Thomas Aquinas' Ode. Though this genealogical history has been one of the centers of DH historiographies, I want to reconsider the geopolitical history occurring at this time in Europe. Father Bussa's vision for a digital index Tomasticus was helped by development, funding, training, and technical support from IBM starting in 1949, but it also began as a dissertation project. Written during World War II in Italy, while, quote, up until the end of 1945, Bussa worked on Thomas Aquinas' philosophical texts, surrounded by bombings, Germans, partisans, poor food, and disasters of all sorts, unquote. IBM sponsored this early humanities computing project for several decades. As Bussa himself describes it, it began with a punch card system developed by IBM. Quote, I was given an IBM 858 prototype, which was a kind of transitional link between unit record and data processing machines, unquote. In fact, the most recent book that has delved into this early historiography of DH has called it The Priest and the Punch Cards, as you can see. To understand how Father Bussa's Index Tomasticus is linked to the Third Reich's data management of the Holocaust, you have to understand how both IBM machines are basically the same computational platform that developed from 1933 into the 1950s. When one examines the media archaeology of this platform, what jumps out is its incredible intimacy. In 1933, for Hitler and the Third Reich to begin its first major census to gather data, primarily to identify a range of unwanted bodies in Germany, and especially to identify Jewish bodies, it contracted with IBM Germany, DHOMAG, for a data system to complete this task. The scope of the census and later ones included not just name, age, gender, but also religion, race, disability information. It eventually included medical information, genealogical information pulled from church registries and baptismal books, to financial information from banks, since they all used DHOMAG, and school test scores. This allowed the Third Reich, after the first census in 1933, to begin forced sterilization for the health and well-being of the population, and to start the process of attempting to biologically engineer a superior Aryan race. The DHOMAG Hollerath punch card machine platform allowed the Third Reich to create an early version of Haggerty and Ericsson's, quote, surveillant assemblage, unquote, in which, quote, the surveillant assemblage sees the observed human body broken down by being abstracted from its territorial setting and then reassembled elsewhere, unquote, and in this case, into a punch card computational database. Thus, the industrial textile code moves the punch card from Dr. Bloom to a Victorian imagined computational database to the first series of surveillant assemblages in the form of the creation of the US Census database, and finally travels back to Europe for its devastating use in the Third Reich. And I'd like to just insert here, it's not that just it's Germany. There was a recent article in the Washington Post that discussed that it was actually the census in that was used in order to identify all the Japanese Americans in the US and find them block by block and send them to the concentration camps, to the internment camps. The interesting thing there is they were not able to do it until 1940 because the head of the census refused to hand over the data, but then got fired. That's kind of an interesting bit of history. That's work being done at the University of Wisconsin. IBM's worldwide policies were to never sell machines, but to always lease them, lease the parts, manufacture specific materials, punch cards themselves for the machine, and to customize everything to each customer's specific projects and goals. Thus, the IBM Hollerath platform for the Third Reich was custom designed and continuously upgraded, developed, and expanded for the specifications of their largest clients. IBM would create separate specific systems from its holograph machine platform to design, among other things, the systematic inventory of the Luftwaffe war machine parts, the entire German railroad system and its schedules and cargoes, and the registration, identification, sorting, and genocide of the Jews in Germany and eventually all other invaded territories. IBM didn't just supply machines and punch cards. They were intimately involved in creating and designing the entire database from the ground up. They worked with each project to decide what fields would be programmed on the punch card itself, including what to use in its 60-column by 10 horizontal field format. This allowed for 600 punch hole possibilities and thus an endless combination of information: biology, disability, location, genealogy, race, physical characteristics, income, profession, family members, etc. As with the standard in the history of early computer science and computation, the bulk of the people working, fine-tuning, and processing the data were women. Thus, for example, the first 1933 Nazi census, DEOMOG used a Berlin employment agency linked to the German Labor Front, a group known for its radical Nazi leanings. They used Nazi patriotism in their job call for their first positions. They hired over 900 plus women and trained them in a 2-week data processing immersion course. What these women included punching in data from handwritten census questionnaires, and then they would sort, tabulate, verify, cross-reference, and complete other data processing tasks. They were thus writing computational code when they translated written census questionnaires into punch card code. There has been much work in the history of computer science to begin acknowledging and boosting the women who were integral to its field. This includes Ada Lovelace, the Bletchley Hall women in World War II, and even more recently, the book and the movie Hidden Figures that discusses the African-American women computers of NASA. However, less is discussed about what I would call the alt-feminism or Nazi feminism of this history. Likewise, the punch cards were not sturdy, easily acquired, or stable material. Because of the delicacy of each holograph machine, the punch cards had precise material dimension and other specifications. Quote, because electrical current in the machine sends the rectangular holes, even to make the card inoperable and could foul up the entire works. So IBM production specifications were rigorous. Chemical pulp was milled, treated, and cured to create paper stock containing no more than 5% ash and developed of ground wood called fibers, processing chemicals, slime, carbon, or other impurities that might conduct electricity and therefore cause incorrect machine sensing. Residues, even in trace amounts, would accumulate on gears and other mechanisms, eventually causing jams and system shutdowns. Electrical testing to isolate defective sheets was mandatory. Paper then cut had to lie flat without curl or wrinkle and featured a hard, smooth finish on either side that yielded a good snap or rattle. Tolerances necessitated laboratory-like mill conditions. Paper thickness 0.0067 inches, plus or minus only a microscopic 0.0005 inch. Width 3.25 inches with a variance of plus 0.007 inches or minus 0.003 inches. Two basic lengths were produced, 5.265 inches and 7.375 inches, plus or minus only 0.005 inch in either case. Edges were to be cut at true right angles, corners to be perfect 60-degree angles, with a 1/4 inch along the top and 3/8 along the side, all free from blade creases with paper grading running the length of the card. Relative humidity of 50% and a temperature of 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit was required at all times including transportation and storage, unquote. IBM had a monopoly on the cards, and at various points during the 30s and 40s, 1/3 of their revenue came from the sale of cards used in data processing. The cards are a form of media archaeology, and what they tell us about this computational processing platform is that it needed a lot of bodies and hands for it to work efficiently. These bespoke computational systems that required constant hands-on maintenance, as well as a satellite of manufacturing units nearby that produced both parts and the cards themselves. The people who designed, built, ran, and maintained these machines were intimately involved in what these machines were built to do. This was not abstract or distance data processing. And DEOMOG knew clearly that they had created a total and racialized surveillance system of the Third Reich's population. They even used it to advertise their services by referencing the media material itself that made it possible, the punch card. The holograph system was an intimate, hands-on, labor-intensive data processing method. This meant that there were also holograph systems at various strengths, types, and vintage. A concentration camps throughout the lake. And it's with the example of Auschwitz that I would like to end this section, because it makes so explicitly clear how much data itself is about explicit and implicit embodiment. Starting in 1933, and with every subsequent census and then annexation of more European territory, the holograph system gave each Jew a number, which then allowed them to be tracked through its system. Recently, documents have been unearthed at Auschwitz that definitively show that the holograph numbers were tattooed on the Auschwitz Jews during the summer of 1943, though tattooing numbers would vanish into different systems afterward. This is a horrible example of biometric identification, and an example of what Brown, Haggerty, and Erickson explained as the marking of the surveillance assemblage that reduced flesh to pure information, unquote. Thus, the holograph card information was tattooed on the flesh. As archivists have recently discovered, this means, as archivists have recently discovered, this means that there was an IBM customer site at the concentration camp. It was a huge IT carbon factory complex that was at Monowitz concentration camp. It ran all three major areas of Auschwitz. Auschwitz I dealt with transit, labor, and detention. Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau, where extermination happened in Auschwitz III, known as Monowitz, which was a slave labor camp. The size of this particular IBM center in Auschwitz would have included a dozen punch card machines, a sorter, and one tabulator. The bodies needed to run the data processing would have amounted to close to 30 to 40 women, along with their German supervisors. If IBM's participation in helping to create an indexing program for Thomas Aquinas' data is one genealogy in the digital humanities, the entwined one occurring also in the 40s is IBM's negotiation with the Third Reich to use IBM's holograph punch card machine in automating the process of identifying Jews and census data, registration forms, and government records that allowed Germany to manage and automate the Holocaust to, in essence, create a genocidal racialized surveillance assemblage. In this way, I'm using Foucault's concept of genealogy to disrupt an idea of technological progress and mythic and innocent origins. I have taken this Foucauldian genealogy of the digital humanities back because I believe we must, as humanists, be uncomfortable about the positivist historiography of humanities computing. As medieval graphestes, the visualization of knowledge, this is the work of Joanna Drucker, and 12th century scholastic university education invented and refined the forms of the index, concordance, and table of contents. There's a rather disquieting and discomforting appropriateness to this uncanny medieval modern digital history. This entangled Jewish-Christian history underscores the ethics of data and the devastation, destruction, and horror of computational data that fueled the birth of humanities computing. Todd Pressner writes about the intertwined issues of ethics in digital humanities and Jewish studies in his article, The Ethics of the Algorithm. Pressner references IBM and the holograph punch card machine to foreground a discussion of Holocaust digital projects and what he discusses as the limits and possibilities of the algorithm. In essence, IBM's collaboration with the Third Reich and its refinement of computational census processing invented the racial census, listing not just religious affiliation, but bloodlines going back generations, not just to count the Jews, but to identify them. In this case, the beginning of humanities computing, the beginning of the computational algorithm that led to Busse's Index Tomasticus, was so efficient and complete a database system, it exterminated millions of European Jews. Thus, the first big data project in the digital humanities was a project of racial religious genocide. So, Busse, bombs, and DARPA. In 1949, Thomas J. Watson met Robert Busse in New York, and Busse convinced him to give both technical and financial support to build an index for Borum, an index of words for the entire corpus of Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Italian theologian, which constituted a, quote, massive lemmatized concordance to the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, unquote. Relation lasted several decades. There were several options when Busse decided to work through his index with computational method, but he had other options, including Vanneberg's Bush Rocket Selector. In the end, he chose a cartotype and punch card system. IBM helped him customize, set up, and equip his project in a former cloth